evidence. You will need to select your best evidence to use in your paragraphs to support your claims and your thesis. Here is what you need to do. Step 1, you need to look through your evidence from your research and identify what claim each piece of evidence could support. Not each piece of evidence is usable for every claim, so you need to kind of sort and arrange them to determine what can be used to support what. You will then need to decide which pieces of evidence would best support each claim. In a paragraph, you're only going to be using a few pieces of evidence, so you're going to have to narrow down which pieces of evidence are going to most effectively support your claim. 3, you will have to decide whether that evidence should be directly quoted or paraphrased, and you will then write that evidence into your outline. Let's go through a sample to select evidence. So the thesis we're going to work with is the worst pandemic ever was the influenza of 1918. The topic sentence we are going to use for this sample, the worst pandemic ever was the influenza of 1918 because of its high mortality rate. So the supporting reason we need evidence for is that it had a high mortality rate, and that made it the worst pandemic ever. So let's look at a list of evidence and determine which evidence can support this claim. Here is some research. Death toll, 20 to 50 million. We think about what point that can help support. That makes a point about total deaths, not high rate of deaths. Rate is different than total number. We have it lasted from 1918 to 1920. That is talking about its duration, not about mortality rate. Infected 1/3 of the world population. That's widespread. It is not talking about how many people it killed out of who caught it. 500 million people infected. Again, that's talking about widespread, not how many died. 10 to 20% of those infected died. That is talking about mortality rate. So that is looking like a promising piece of research that we would potentially consider using. 25 million deaths in the first 25 weeks. That's talking about the speed of the disease. And killed completely healthy young adults. That's kind of talking about the power or impact of the disease. So out of this research, this one here is clearly the piece of evidence that is best going to support our claim. Now that is not enough, because this does give the information about the high mortality rate of the influenza of 1918, but that does not establish it as the worst pandemic ever. So we would need further research, comparing it to other diseases' mortality rates. So you may have to go back and research more. Let's see what we found. Other pandemic mortality rates. Hong Kong flu, 0.5%. I'm saying that's not a fair comparison, because you do want to compare it to other strong, powerful diseases to set up the case that it is the worst pandemic. It should be compared to other bad pandemics. If we talk about comparing it to COVID-19, mortality rate of 4%, that is relevant to modern readers. It would be useful to include. It probably does not stand out as one of the worst pandemics at this point. Smallpox has 2 types. One type had a 1% mortality rate and 1% had a 30% mortality rate. That is a very well-known pandemic, so it is a potential good option to use as additional data. So we'll highlight that. Cholera, if a patient is treated, had a 1% mortality rate. Untreated had a 50 to 60% mortality rate. So we'll highlight that as a possible option. Bubonic plague is very well known. Treated had a 1 to 15% mortality rate. Untreated 50%. I'm a little unsure about using that one, because if you look into it, the main outbreak was so long ago, we had virtually no understanding of medicine. It's kind of almost unfair to compare the two, but it is possible. It would just require some deep analysis to really explain. So we'll highlight that. Yellow fever, 3% to 8%. Not quite sure that's pandemic worthy. That might be more of a case by case basis. So what we end up here is we have our information on the influenza of 1918 of 10 to 20% of those infected died. And then we have some other numbers from some other major outbreaks. I'm going to highlight COVID-19 here just because that'd be interesting comparison for modern readers. So we'll keep these available as potential evidence to use for comparison for our main disease. So this is the evidence that I've selected to use for this paragraph. You should follow a similar process in your own evidence selection. Again, you should be analyzing what the evidence could support, which pieces of evidence best support the claim, making sure you have enough evidence, and then future steps will be taking you through whether that should be directly quoted or paraphrased.